Hi, I'm Christopher Purdy, and I had planned to kind of read from the memoirs of a very interesting composer called Virgil Thompson, and he did go on. So I changed gears a little bit. We're still going to talk about Virgil Thompson and Stravinsky and writing a new opera, but I am reading to you from one of my favorite books. I made the mistake of reading this over last night and knew immediately that I had to bring it today. This is the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas by Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was an American writer who wrote things that nobody to this day understands. Okay? If you do understand it, then you need therapy. She spent all of her adult life in Paris, where she died at the age of 72 in 1946. Her companion for 40 years was Alice B. Toklas. So these are the memoirs of Alice B. Toklas, written by Gertrude Stein. Paris. The year was 1907. The home at 27 Rue de Fleurus consisted then, as it does now, of a tiny pavilion of 2 stories with 4 small rooms, a kitchen and bath, and a very large studio adjoining. Now the studio was attached to the pavilion by a tiny hall passage added in 1914, but at that time the studio had its own entrance. One rang the bell of the studio or knocked at the door, and a great many people did both, but more knocked at the door. I was privileged to do both. I had been invited to dine on Saturday evening, which was the evening when everybody came, and indeed everybody did come. I went to dinner. The dinner was cooked by Elaine. I must tell you a little bit about Elaine. Elaine had already been 2 years with Gertrude Stein and her brother. She was one of those admirable bonnes, in other words, excellent maids of all work, good cooks, thoroughly occupied with the welfare of their employers and of themselves, firmly convinced that everything purchasable was far too dear. Oh, but it is dear, was her answer to any question. She wasted nothing and carried on the household at the regular rate of 8 francs a day. She even wanted to include guests at that price. It was her pride. But of course that was difficult, since she had the honor of the house, as well as to satisfy her employers always, and she had to give everybody enough to eat. She was a most excellent cook, and she made a very good souffle. In those days, most of the guests were living more or less precariously. No one starved, someone always helped out, but still most of them did not live in abundance. It was Brock who said about 4 years later, when they were all beginning to be known, with a sigh and a smile, how life has changed. We all now have cooks who can make a souffle. Helene had her opinions. She did not, for instance, like Matisse. She said a Frenchman should not stay unexpectedly to a meal, particularly if he asked the servant beforehand what there was for dinner. She said foreigners had a perfect right to do these things, but not a Frenchman, and Matisse had once done it. So when Miss Stein said to her, Matisse is staying for dinner this evening, she would say, in that case, I will not make an omelet, but I will fry the eggs. It takes the same number of eggs and the same amount of butter, but it shows less respect, and he will understand. Once more, I came to Paris, and now I am among the habitués of the Rue de Fleurus. Gertrude Stein was writing The Making of Americans, and she had just commenced correcting the proofs of 3 lives. I helped her correct them. Gertrude Stein was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. As I am an ardent Californian, and as she spent her youth there, I have often begged her to be born in California, but she has always remained firmly born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. She left it when she was 6 months old and has never seen it again, and now it no longer exists, being Olivet, Pittsburgh. She used, however, to delight in being born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, when, during the war, in connection with war work, we used to have papers made out, and they always immediately wanted to know where one was born. She used to say if she had really been born in California, as I wanted her to have been, she would never have had the pleasure of seeing the various French officials try to write down Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Florence Bradley asked us to go with her to see the second performance of The Rite of Spring. The Russian ballet had just given the first performance of it and had made a terrible uproar. We went early. These were the great early days of the Russian ballet and Nijinsky, the great dancer. And a great dancer he was. Dancing excites me tremendously, and it is a thing I know a great deal about. I have seen 3 very great dancers. My geniuses seem to run in 3s, but that is not my fault, it happens to be a fact. The 3 really great dancers I have seen are La Argentina, Isadora Duncan, and Nijinsky. Like the 3 geniuses I have known, they are each one of a different personality. Nijinsky did not dance in the Rite of Spring, but he created the dances of those who did dance. The performance began. No sooner had it commenced than the excitement began. The scene, now so well known with its brilliantly colored background, was not all that extraordinary, but it outraged the Paris audience. No sooner did the music begin and the dancing that they began to hiss. The defenders began to applaud. We could hear nothing. As a matter of fact, I never did hear any of the music of the Rite of Spring, because it was the only time I ever saw it, and one literally could not, throughout the whole performance, hear the music. The dancing was very fine, and that we could see, although our attention was constantly distracted by a man in the box next to us flourishing his cane. And finally, in a violent altercation with an enthusiast in the box next to him, his cane came down and smashed the opera hat the other had just put on in defiance. It was all incredibly fierce. In the meantime, as I have said, George Antile had brought Virgil Thompson to the house, and Virgil Thompson and Gertrude Stein became friends and saw each other a great deal. Virgil Thompson had put a number of Gertrude Stein's things to music, Susi Asado, Preziosilla, and Capitals. Gertrude Stein was very much interested in Virgil Thompson's music. He had understood Satie, undoubtedly, and he had a comprehension quite of his own protege. He understood a great deal of Gertrude Stein's work. He used to dream at night that there was something there that he did not understand, but on the whole he was very well content with that which he did understand. She delighted to listening to her words framed by his music. They saw a great deal of each other. Everyone began at this time to be very occupied with their own affairs. Virgil Thompson had asked Gertrude Stein to write an opera for him. Among the saints, there were 2 saints whom she had always liked better than any others, St. Teresa of Avila and Ignatius Loyola, and she said she would write him an opera about these 2 saints. She began this and worked very hard at it all that spring, and finally finished 4 saints in 3 acts, and gave it to Virgil Thompson to put to music. He did, and it is a completely interesting opera, both as to words and music. For some time now, many people and publishers have been asking Gertrude Stein to write her autobiography, and she has always replied, not possibly. She began to tease me and say that I should write my autobiography. Just think, she would say, what a lot of money you would make. She then began to invent titles for my autobiography: My Life with the Great, Wives of Geniuses I Have Sat With, or My 25 Years with Gertrude Stein. Then she began to get serious and say, but really seriously, you ought to write your autobiography. Finally, I promised that if during the summer I could find a time, I would write my autobiography. When Ford Madox Ford was editing the Transatlantic Review, he once said to Gertrude Stein, I am a pretty good writer and a pretty good editor and a pretty good businessman, but I find it very difficult to be all 3 at once. I am a pretty good housekeeper, and a pretty good gardener, and a pretty good needlewoman, and a pretty good secretary, and a pretty good editor, and a pretty good vet for dogs, and I have to do them all at once. And I found it difficult to add being a pretty good author. About 6 weeks ago, Gertrude Stein said, it does not look to me as if you were ever going to write that autobiography. You know what I am going to do. I am going to write it for you. I am going to write it as simply as Defoe did the autobiography of Robinson Crusoe. And she has, and this is it.